Here to join us, talk a little bit more about this. I want to introduce you to Shelby Emmett. She's a First Amendment attorney, freedom of speech advocate. She's done extensive work. She's a former legislative counsel for members of Congress, responsible for the largest legislative portfolio for the member, including education, immigration, social services, health care, and the judiciary. Also, Shelby is a contributor to Project 21, which is an initiative of the National Center for Public Policy Research to promote the views of African Americans whose entrepreneurial spirit, dedication to family, and commitment to individual responsibility hasn't traditionally been echoed by the nation's civil rights leaders. Shelby, thanks so much for being with us this morning.
Well, thank you so much for having me. How are you?
I'm doing well. So first of all, tell us a little bit about Project 21.
Sure. So basically, the idea is to help minority voices have more presence in public policy. Being a conservative, I'm from Detroit originally. Shocker, the Republican Party is a disaster at actually trying to reach new people. And I always say, if I actually had to listen to a conservative when I was growing up, I never would have became one. I became a conservative through my own experience, but a lot of the ways people talk about things just don't resonate for a young black girl in Detroit. So the whole premise of the organization is just to help encourage more minority voices with different points of view, and also help the public at large understand that we're not a monolithic group. We have completely different ideas and opinions, just like everybody else, and sometimes we even come at it from a different perspective, but utilizing the same conservative principles.
I think that's fantastic. Definitely, we have to communication's key, in any relationship, is that what people always say? Well, you just got to work on your communication. Well, Shelby, what do you make? What do you make of the rhetoric here in the wake of these two tragedies, and balancing that against the First Amendment?
Well, it always scares the First Amendment field whenever a tragedy happens. Yes, it's tragic, and then in itself, of course, is a tragedy. But in my field, we're always concerned about the emotional reaction, because the first thing that people go after is always speech. I think for most people, it's the idea, the concept that something horrible has happened and you want to be able to do something. So the best way to do it is to point a finger, blame a tangible object, and then try to do something about that, right? So this happens on both sides. It did happen when Barack Obama was president. I worked in issues with Black Lives Matter issues, and even if people are saying horrible things about the police officers, someone deciding to hurt a police officer is the responsibility and the actions of that individual, just like here. Regardless of the rhetoric of what anybody is saying, that young man chose to make a decision, and he made those decisions for himself. Nobody forced him to do anything. He did it on his own. So in my field, we're always concerned about this call for hate speech, and now, violent or rhetoric is now violent. And we have to be very careful about that. As a minority, I understand it. I get it. I've had people call me horrible words and say horrible things to me, but that doesn't give me any type of justification to use violence, and we can't excuse it in this situation either.
Yeah, absolutely. That's very well put. So, I mean, so this idea is, where we have people saying, this is Donald Trump's fault. There are some that are saying this, that he's responsible for this. Now, I don't even think that necessarily comports with the fact, considering the white supremacist down in Texas said, I think what's funny, if the manifesto's accurate, he said, well, hang on a second. This is not Trump's fault. Just so you know, I held these views before Trump. That doesn't seem to matter, some of the reporting is, and there's so many people on the left that really do believe this. They believe that that his rhetoric is responsible for what's happened, and that's just not true. So I agree with what you're saying, Shelby. We have to hold the people who pull the trigger or who actually do the actions responsible.
Exactly, and we all have to be concerned here, because this does go back and forth on both sides. You hear the same talk sometimes on the right whenever anyone criticizes Israel, for example. Simply criticizing something is not automatically anti-Semitic, and you have members on the right that also want to push measures that would make that a potential crime as well, to do any of those things. So we have to be careful on both sides. And I always tell people that You cannot blame rhetoric because one day you are going to say something. I promise you. We've all been there, and it's happening more and more. That is going to hurt someone's feelings. And the level of sensitivity in American society today is mind-boggling to me. I think the one stereotype that I loved about being an American was that we were just hardworking and we kept going and we were full of grit. And now it just seems like it's in vogue now to just be completely offended by the slightest thing. And I can tell you in my field, you see it more on the left, but it can be very equal opportunity. You've got a whole generation of young people, both conservative and liberal, that just have a very thin skin.
So I'm assuming, being this First Amendment advocate, that you certainly, are aware of the freedom of speech issues on college campuses. So can you speak to that at all? That to me is disturbing. When we have these institutions that are supposed to be about freedom of thought, but kind of diminish the First Amendment a little bit.
Exactly. So campus speech issues is something that I probably spend the majority of my time with right now. And it's twofold. So the first basic premise is, yes, on your public campuses. So, for example, I went to Michigan State. Michigan State is a public institution. Public institutions are required to uphold the First Amendment, which means they can't silence people based off content and viewpoint. They can have, proper regulations, but they have to be, reasonable, and they have to apply to everybody, right? Private institutions can do whatever the heck they want. So as much as people may get annoyed with the Ivy Leagues and what they do, at the end of the day, they're private institutions. So we don't really care about that in the First Amendment world. We do in terms of if they promise the free expression of ideas, but in terms of the actual law in the First Amendment, they also have a freedom of association right, which is why institutions like Hillsdale College can do what they would like to do as well. But the problem in college campuses is also cultural, right? This is a problem of hearing too much of the same idea and then being told that anything you don't like to hear is a problem. But it's also a problem that conservatives are also leaving academia, or we don't even try to go into it. So, this idea that, the left controls the academy, it's true, but we also tend not to go into the academy. Now, can it be harder? Yes, but we also never get in there. So it is a twofold problem. Most importantly, though, what I always try to tell conservative parents is, one, stop teaching your children that just because someone doesn't agree with them or the professor may not like the views, that doesn't mean that they're being censored. I'm a black woman from Detroit who was a conservative. I've been called every single name in the book throughout college, law school, and to today, and I've always stood my ground. So just because you're afraid of something or you're afraid of your grade, that's up to you. You still have to decide to have a backbone and stand up for yourself. But I also encourage parents specifically, contact your members of Congress at the state level. Look up the speech codes. There's organizations like thefire.org. You can go to different websites and see where these schools' rankings are, and stop sending your children there. Stop giving your donations to them until your school reforms their codes. My school, Michigan State, doesn't have great codes right now, so I refuse to donate to them. And I write them every year when they write me, and I say, nope, reform your codes, and then we'll talk. So the best way to change the culture here is with the dollar. And parents don't have to keep sending their kids to these institutions. They can demand that these changes are made.
That's a really good point. Yeah, here in Arkansas, we recently passed, the State Representative Dan Sullivan and other legislators recently passed freedom of speech on Arkansas college campuses. There was an issue, there's an issue at Arkansas State where there are these freedom of speech zones, and so, and I think there's still a lawsuit pending on that. But there was immediate legislative action, thankfully, that, we want to make sure that kids can, say what they want to say on a college campus. We're talking
exactly, and a lot of this is the fault of the adults. I always remind people, you can't go after young people for acting like fools until you first hold the college campus president who's making six figures accountable, right? Just like you need to hold the campus police accountable who think it's okay to detain a student for holding the Constitution and trying to pass them out. You don't go after the 19-year-old private citizen until you go after the public official who thinks it's up to him to pick and choose what students are allowed to be exposed to.
We're talking with Shelby Emmett. She is a First Amendment attorney, and she's also, very experienced, has, quite the resume. It says here, Shelby, before working on Capitol Hill, you worked for a public health nonprofit responsible for policy development and implementation. It included advocacy for the state and federal policymakers. Also, you've appeared with the Daily Caller, frequent guest on national, television shows, and I really was in, prepping for this interview, Shelby. I went and watched some of your appearances, and I really think you're terrific, and appreciate the points that you make, and really appreciate you coming on the program this morning. It's been great to meet you. Hope we can do it again sometime.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I would love to come back on. You guys have a great, fabulous day.
You too. You too.